It was a sweltering afternoon in the city, the kind that makes people impatient and irritable. In an upscale clothing store on Main Street, Adam was standing behind the counter, scanning the room with a judgmental eye. As a seasoned salesman, he prided himself on his ability to size up customers the moment they walked through the door. In his mind, he could tell just by looking at someone whether they could afford the store's expensive suits and luxury items. He liked to think he knew who belonged and who didn't. Today, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. Adam, a man in his late 40s, had worked at this boutique for nearly a decade. He wore his uniform with a sense of pride, but underneath his polished exterior was a narrow world view. He had always been courteous to wealthier customers, particularly those who looked like him. But if someone came in who didn't fit his mold, someone who seemed out of place, Adam's demeanor would change. He wouldn't be rude outright, at least not at first. His condescension was subtle, masked behind tight smiles and short responses, enough to send the message that they weren't welcome without directly saying it. It was how he kept his authority intact. That afternoon, a man named Brian walked into the store. He strolled in casually, not particularly concerned with the judgmental eyes that followed him. Tall, broad-shouldered, and confident, Brian's presence commanded attention. He wore a simple outfit, a plain t-shirt, well-worn jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Nothing about him screamed wealth or prestige, but there was an ease in the way he moved, a quiet confidence that hinted at a man who knew himself well. He had come to buy a suit for a family event, something nice, but nothing extravagant. Adam noticed Brian the moment he entered, and his lips tightened into a thin line. He didn't like the look of this customer. In his mind, people who walked into a store like this should dress the part, and Brian certainly didn't. He kept his eyes on Brian as he moved through the aisles, looking at the suits. There was something about the man that made Adam uneasy. Maybe it was the way he seemed so comfortable, as if he belonged here despite his appearance. That confidence unsettled Adam. As Brian walked past a row of shoes, his phone rang. Distracted, he answered it, not noticing that he had accidentally stepped on Adam's polished leather shoes. Adam's face twisted in irritation as he looked down at the scuff mark on his expensive shoes, feeling his temper flare. To him, this was the final straw. Brian noticed the slight misstep as he hung up his phone and immediately turned toward Adam. "Oh, sorry about that, man," he said, his voice calm and genuine. He didn't make a big deal of it, just offered an apology as anyone would. But Adam wasn't having it. The annoyance and prejudice he had been bottling up since the moment Brian walked in suddenly exploded. "Watch where you're going," he spat, his voice low, but filled with venom. Brian raised an eyebrow, surprised by the hostility in Adam's tone. "I said I'm sorry," he repeated, still calm, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Adam wasn't interested in apologies. His anger had already taken root, fueled by something deeper than just a stepped-on shoe. "You think you can just walk in here and act like you own the place?" he snapped, his voice growing louder, drawing the attention of the other customers. Brian was taken aback by the sudden hostility. "What are you talking about? I'm just looking to buy a suit." Adam crossed his arms, glaring at Brian. "People like you don't belong here," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Brian stood there, staring at Adam, trying to process what he was hearing. "People like me?" he echoed. "What does that even mean?" Adam didn't even try to hide his prejudice anymore. "You know exactly what I mean. You walk in here dressed like that, disrespecting me. You're nothing but trouble." The words hung in the air, the tension in the store rising. The other customers, who had been quietly shopping, began to notice the confrontation. Some of them started whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Adam and Brian. Then, without warning, Adam's anger boiled over. He reached out and slapped Brian across the face, the sound of the impact echoing through the store like a gunshot. Gasps filled the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The other customers stopped in their tracks, their eyes wide with disbelief. Brian didn't move. His face remained stoic, though his eyes narrowed slightly as he processed what had just happened. He had been slapped, publicly humiliated by this man who clearly had no idea who he was. Brian didn't react the way most would expect. He didn't lash out or retaliate. Instead, he simply stood there, his posture relaxed, his eyes focused on Adam. The store fell into an eerie silence, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The other customers stood frozen, watching and waiting to see what would happen next. They had expected a fight, a heated exchange, but Brian's calm demeanor seemed to throw everyone off, including Adam. It wasn't long before the murmurs started. People began whispering to each other, some even stepping back as if realizing they were too close to something dangerous. They recognized Brian's name, his presence carrying weight in the city, and it didn't take long for word to spread through the store. "That's Brian," someone whispered to their friend. "He's the head of the city's most powerful group." Adam's eyes darted around the store as he began to pick up on the murmurs. His anger, once so fierce and unrestrained, began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The room had shifted, the energy palpable. The more Adam heard, the more he realized the gravity of what he had done. His heart began to race as the whispers reached him. "Did you hear? That's Brian," another customer muttered. "The guy who runs the whole city." Adam's face drained of color as he looked at Brian, finally understanding that the man standing in front of him wasn't just any customer. He wasn't someone to be humiliated, and certainly not someone to be slapped. This was a man who commanded respect, and not just from his group. The whispers grew louder, the tension in the room unbearable as Adam began to panic. Brian remained silent, his eyes still fixed on Adam. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough to fill the room with an almost suffocating pressure. The customers, once eager to shop, now stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brian spoke. His voice was calm but commanding. "You've got a lot of nerve, Adam," he said quietly, his tone betraying none of the anger he could have unleashed. "But let me tell you something. I don't cause trouble unless I have to." Adam's mouth went dry, his throat tightening as he tried to respond. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice shaky. Brian raised a hand, silencing him. "No, you didn't know. But that doesn't change what you did." Adam's heart pounded in his chest. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. The man he had insulted and slapped was far more powerful than he could have ever imagined. And now, standing face to face with him, Adam realized just how much trouble he was in. Brian took a step closer, his voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now. "You think slapping me, humiliating me in front of all these people makes you better than me? Because I stepped on your shoes?" He shook his head, slowly. "It's not about the shoes, Adam. We both know that." Adam's eyes flickered with fear. He could feel the weight of his mistake crushing down on him, and he couldn't escape it. "I'm sorry," he blurted out, his voice trembling. Brian's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Adam, his gaze unwavering. "Sorry isn't enough, Adam. You think a simple apology can make up for what you did? For the hate you carry?" Adam shook his head, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to. I just—" Brian cut him off, his voice cold. "You think you can walk around treating people like they're less than you because of the color of their skin?" Adam opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He had no defense, no excuse. He had spent years judging people, thinking himself superior, and now, in this moment, it had all come crashing down around him.